Common Sense Radio.
Why is it never light on my lawn? Why did it rain and never say good day to the newborn?
Good morning, you bunch of drunks.
At the beginning of the season, when Colin Kaepernick did his little I'm going to take a knee at the end of American flag, national anthem, blah, blah, blah. It was pretty clear even before the season started that he was probably doing it because he stinks and he doesn't have anything else kind of to grasp onto. And there was even a question as to whether or not he was really even going to play. Now that they're, 1-11 now?
I know it's not good.
Well, they benched him.
Yeah.
And he had threw 4 interceptions. I mean, he's an awful quarterback. And he was an awful quarterback at the first game. So,
and yes, they're 1-11.
That's where they're at now.
You think he saw his irrelevancy,
of course,
becoming clear, and
that's what people said. Something. I mean, it was kind of people who knew a little bit about sports were like, "Don't worry about this guy. He's only doing this because he doesn't have much of a life outside of this."
Yeah.
And indeed, it turns out that's the case. People in San Francisco, well, some of them at least, must be furious because they don't get anything out of this. They get humiliation from him and a losing record, and there's nothing to be gained from having this guy. Did you see this thing in the Post-Dispatch? I tweeted this out. It's the whole fake news thing. So this reporter, Aisha Sultan, the Post-Dispatch and their entire editorial board, these guys are as corrupt as the day is long. As you know, a while back I had to expose them because this political editor, there's chock full of editors. I don't know why they have so many editors, but they do. And I'm sure they're all paid 10 times more than the reporters are. But this Christopher Ov guy goes on with his some kind of podcast or something. That's just, and so he's on there with Aisha Sultan and one of the other editors. And he talks about fake news and makes a direct reference to my TV show and calls that fake news and says bought and paid for by Rex Sinkefeld, which of course is false. I actually should, honestly, I should sue their asses, but I'm not going to because the attorney I consulted on said they don't have enough subscribers for you to prove damages. Because you have to prove damages. But the guy said you have to prove damages by showing that they actually damaged you. And that would have to you'd have to show that people actually read their newspaper or, for instance, listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
Because right now they're giving newspapers away, and certainly very few people are listening to the podcast. So I really couldn't. I probably gave it more attention than it ever got. But anyway, they were talking about fake news. So Aisha Sultan is part of this whole group sitting there on the podcast, and these guys never learn from being called out for their hypocrisy. So she does a story, and I saw the headline on this. I go, here we go. It said, teaching children how to spot real news from fake news. I'm going, oh, this ought to be good. This ought to be really good. First of all, it begins with her talking to this guy who's a public librarian, okay? And she said, a recent analysis showed that fake or hoax stories got more reader engagement on Facebook than real news stories during the last 3 months of the election. Now, keep in mind that recent analysis in your mind. Because later in the story, she says, always be wary of websites that don't cite their sources. You believe that? So she doesn't cite her own source for the recent analysis, but later on says, make sure the only trusted site is one that will cite its sources. And she doesn't even cite her sources in a story about how important it is to cite sources. I mean, that's how hypocritical and tone deaf these people are. They don't even realize their own corruption. They just actually go full bore on it and act as if no one's going to notice. And usually people don't. You know where the recent analysis came from, right? About the fake, that whole face. It came from BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed is quite possibly the most left-wing aggregate you're going to find out there in terms of news. And it was based on nothing, no factual basis at all. They analyzed certain elements here and there, but they couldn't. That's not a conclusion they could draw. But anyway, there's a reason why she didn't cite them, because she'd be citing BuzzFeed as her source. I mean, who the hell cites BuzzFeed as a source of information? Especially a hack website like that. And that's why she left it out. Now, somebody who does a story that says be wary of sites that don't cite their sources, and they don't cite their sources, that's unbelievable. But it's coming from the Post-Dispatch, so I tweeted that out. Also, keep in mind that here's another one that she talked about. Peters, who's the librarian, encourages readers to get context clues from a site's domain name. Sites that end in .gov are from the U.S. government, while EDU is an educational institution, and reminds them to trust their guts. If a site looks unprofessional, it probably is. So the subtext there obviously is only trust sources from websites that have .gov on them and .edu. I mean, if this newspaper is not the biggest, statist rag on the planet, I don't know what is. But that's their advice, is to tell kids that only trust. I mean, that's basically what I'm gathering from it. You might gather something else. But what I'm gathering from that is when you pointedly point out that edu and .gov are good indicators of trustworthiness, what does that tell you? But that's in this story. We'll put the story back on the electric stove so you can read it. It didn't get a lot of attention because most people just assume that the Post is corrupt. But I always like it when I'm able to actually see it in front of my very eyes. 969-9797.